Let me now just make a couple of introductory thoughts about some of the issues that we face in the world of science, technology, and for that matter, society. I think the issues really are about a mixture of influence and impact, accountability and independence, which have a kind of complex relationship to each other. A number of different things have happened in the relatively recent past that have concerned many of us who are interested in the science and technology community. One is the famous event about the sacking of Professor David Nutt from the Advisory Committee on Drug Misuse. The second is the event surrounding the furore storm in a teacup, in my view, around the University of East Anglia, but the political ramifications are much greater than a storm in a teacup. The third issue is the sometimes vitriolic debate about whether the new research excellence framework for universities should include as large a component of what is called impact as is currently planned, and what that might mean. And then, of course, in the impact of the recession, there are serious cuts coming in higher education, science, technology and research budgets, which we will have to fight against, but will nevertheless need to respond to some extent. Let me say something briefly about each of these things. The first is the David Nutt issue and the problem of the relationship of government to science. It's perfectly clear that government is not required to take the advice of its scientific advisory committees, but I think it should be clear that if government chooses not to, it should say why not, and not to disrespect, as it seemed, the advice it got in the first place. Clearly, science does have an influence on public policy and should have an influence on public policy, but it cannot and should not determine public policy. So it's legitimate for government not to take advice, but important that it should respect that advice and say clearly why it chooses not to do so. So while there's been a lot of publicity about the notion that government must take account of science in this area, science should have impact, there's also been another opposite kind of debate in which at least some members of the scientific community have been arguing very strongly that impact is not an important criterion by which scientific research should be judged. And of course, there's always been and always will be an argument in favour of blue skies research which is not directed to some immediate goal. On the other hand, if one argues too strongly against the notion that impact matters, there is a question of accountability and why it is that public funds should be devoted to something where the social, economic and environmental effects are not clear. So there is a difficult balance to be struck there. Second main issue, the University of East Anglia, the climate change and supposed falsification of data issue, does seem to me to be very serious in the long term. There are, as we all know, very large vested interests, political and economic, in proving that climate change science is fraudulent. I just happened to listen to Radio 4 yesterday and heard someone with absolutely no qualifications give his opinion that it was a fraud. The problem is that there are many people who have a very strong interest in believing that it's a fraud, and that is seriously undermining for the reputation of science if that becomes more widespread. Although it has also to be recognised that it's historically unique that a bunch of around 2,000 scientists should apparently have such a determining effect upon the world's social and economic policies over the next 40 and 50 years. This is something we've never seen before, and the legitimacy of that enterprise is bound to be open to scrutiny. Finally, on the subject of recession and public funding, another issue of impact is, of course, the notion that science and technology should have a strong impact on the commercial world and be useful to business and help business make money, and that, of course, is legitimate. On the other hand, if you do take climate change seriously, and you do think that we have to cut carbon emissions by 80% by the year 2050, you cannot simply think that economic growth, still a very powerful objective and motivator, can continue exactly as before. We do have to think what kinds of economic growth we need, and correspondingly the kinds of science and technology that we need to develop. In other words, the issues are not just about the pace and the scale of scientific advance, they are about the direction as well. And in a climate where funding is being probably removed to some extent, the issue of direction will become more important than ever. So those are my hopefully slightly provocative opening thoughts for the day.